You ever think your neighbor's harmless gossip could end with flashing red and blue lights in your driveway? Well, last Saturday morning, that's exactly what happened when our HOA's self-appointed enforcer, let's just call her Karen, peeked through our front window and saw something she didn't like. To be fair, my wife, Andrea, did look intimidating. Except Karen had no clue that Andrea wasn't some random woman flashing a weapon. She's the new chief of police in our small town. Something Karen never bothered to learn before dialing 911. It all started when Andrea came home after her first week on the job. She was exhausted but proud, still in her official uniform with her service pistol holstered on her belt. We live in a gated community that loves to call itself tight-knit. But lately, it feels more like a nest of busybodies. Karen's been itching for any excuse to flex her so-called HOA authority ever since we moved in. That morning, I was inside brewing coffee when I heard the tires crunch on our driveway, 2 squad cars pulling up with lights blazing, officers stepping out, hands hovering near their holsters. My stomach dropped. Andrea stood on the porch, arms crossed, gun holstered exactly where it should be. She looked at me through the front door, one eyebrow raised, as if to say, "Can you believe this?" The cops, clearly caught off guard, seemed confused about why they were even there. One of them recognized Andrea immediately, his boss. Karen, though? She was strutting around like she'd just stopped a crime spree. She waved her phone in the air, yelling about unregistered firearms and dangerous people in the neighborhood. I swear, the world slowed down when Andrea stepped off the porch, calmly removed her sunglasses, and walked up to Karen. I could almost see the moment Karen realized she'd made a massive mistake. But by then, the whole neighborhood was gathering on their lawns, whispering behind their hands. Did Karen apologize? Of course not. She doubled down, accusing Andrea of abusing her badge. What she didn't realize was that calling the cops on the chief of police would flip our entire HOA upside down. And trust me, Karen's about to learn there's only one thing more dangerous than gossip, messing with the law when the law is married to me. Picture prompt, opening hook: a clear, daylight suburban scene. A confident woman in a police chief uniform stands calmly on her front porch with her service pistol holstered. In the driveway, 2 police cars have their lights on. A flustered neighbor, middle-aged woman with a clipboard and phone, gestures dramatically at the officers while curious neighbors peek from lawns and windows. The atmosphere is tense but not dark, more like a brewing neighborhood drama. I wish I could say Karen's petition flopped right away, but that'd be too easy. For the first time since we moved in, we saw just how deep her reach really was. Some neighbors, especially the ones who'd benefited from her HOA favors, signed her paper without even reading it. They didn't care that Andrea was the chief of police, they just didn't want Karen showing up on their doorstep next. Andrea didn't flinch. She spent nights hunched over the dining table, going through stacks of HOA bylaws. What amazed me most was how calmly she did it. She'd pause to sip her tea, jot down a note, then cross-reference each section like she was building a case, because she was. But the deeper she dug, the messier it got. Turns out Karen's power didn't come out of nowhere. She'd been bending rules for years, approving fines for violations that didn't exist, pocketing extra fees for repairs that were never done, and threatening homeowners with liens if they asked too many questions. It was a whole rotten network tied together with Karen's fake smile and her relentless intimidation. One evening, Andrea called me over, tapping her finger on a highlighted section. "Look at this. She fined the Harrisons last year for putting up a fence, but there's no record of where that money went. It never hit the HOA account. Are you sure you want to do this?" I asked. Part of me worried Karen would find a way to twist things. But Andrea just leaned back, her eyes fierce. She wanted to make me look like a threat. Fine. Let's show them who the real threat is. At the same time a new wrinkle formed, the neighbors were splitting into sides. Mrs. Henderson across the street, who always kept her head down, started leaving fresh-baked cookies on our porch as a quiet show of support. Meanwhile, the Jenkins family 2 houses over, Karen's loyal echo chamber, watched us like we were criminals. Things escalated fast. Someone posted a photo of Andrea in her uniform on the community Facebook page, claiming she was using her badge to bully residents. The comments turned into a war zone overnight. Some defended her, calling her the best chief the town had seen in decades. Others, clearly fed by Karen's gossip, accused Andrea of turning the neighborhood into a police state. Then there was the knock at our door at midnight. I found an envelope taped to the mailbox the next morning, a fake violation notice with a threat to seize our property if we didn't remove all weapons immediately. It was signed "A Concerned Citizen." Andrea laughed when she saw it, but her fingers trembled slightly as she tucked the envelope into her evidence box. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about everyone Karen had bullied for years. Andrea started meeting quietly with neighbors who'd been hit with bogus fines or threats. Some were too scared to talk, others showed up with files they kept hidden away, canceled checks, old photos, letters from Karen written in her flowery but menacing handwriting. And while Andrea built her case, I couldn't help but worry. Karen wasn't the type to back down gracefully. The more she felt the walls closing in, the more reckless she'd get. One night, as Andrea and I sat by the window watching Karen's porch light flick on and off like a lighthouse of paranoia, Andrea turned to me and said she thinks this is about the gun. But she doesn't realize yet this is about the truth. And I'm not the one who should be scared. I swear, if you'd told me 2 months ago that I'd be standing on my own porch watching my wife explain the law to her own officers because our neighbor couldn't mind her business, I would have laughed. Back then, Andrea and I were just excited to finally move into the so-called perfect community. It felt like the next big step for our family: bigger house, friendlier neighbors, a safer environment for our kids. We should have seen the warning signs the first week. Karen showed up with her famous HOA welcome packet, a thick folder of rules she practically slammed on our dining table. Andrea and I glanced at each other while Karen droned on about proper lawn heights, acceptable mailbox colors, and zero tolerance for firearms on the premises. Andrea politely smiled but didn't mention her new promotion. She wanted to settle in first, to feel like part of the neighborhood instead of walking around with her title stitched on her chest. Turns out that decision gave Karen just enough rope to hang herself with. Ever since that first visit, Karen's been peeking through her curtains like it's her full-time job. She's left passive-aggressive notes about our recycling bins, our Christmas lights staying up too long, and even how many cars we park in the driveway. But Saturday was her masterpiece. While Andrea spoke with the 2 officers, I stepped closer to overhear. The younger cop kept apologizing under his breath. He clearly respected Andrea but didn't know how to handle Karen's loud theatrics. She was in their faces, throwing around words she barely understood: brandishing, reckless endangerment, public safety hazard. All the while, Andrea's calm voice cut through her rant like a blade. "Karen, I am the chief of police," she said. "This firearm is registered, holstered, and being worn by an on-duty officer. You're wasting department resources and could be facing a false report charge if you don't back down." But Karen's eyes darted between the cops and the growing crowd. She wasn't backing down, she was doubling down. I could see the fear turning to something else: desperation. That's when she pointed at me. "He's the one you should watch too," she barked. "He probably hides guns in the house. Do you people even check who you let move in?" That did it. The older cop stepped in, quietly telling Karen to calm herself or face charges for obstruction. But the real damage was already done. Neighbors had their phones out, filming every second. Some whispered that maybe Karen was right. After all, who wears a gun on their porch? Others finally saw her for what she was: a nosy neighbor with a taste for control. Later that night, when the cars drove away and the crowd drifted back behind their closed doors, Andrea slumped at the kitchen table. She looked tired, but her eyes burned with something I hadn't seen in a while: resolve. "Do you think she'll stop?" I asked, half hoping the humiliation would make Karen back off. Andrea just shook her head. "No. People like her? When they feel power slipping, they push back harder." And she was right. The next morning, Karen started a petition to have Andrea removed from the HOA entirely, claiming our family was a threat to the community's peaceful image. She went door to door with that same fake smile she used when she welcomed us. But here's the thing: Andrea's not just the chief. She knows the law inside and out, and she knows how to play the long game. What Karen didn't know yet was that Andrea had started pulling HOA records, checking for irregularities. Because if Karen wanted a war over who's protecting this neighborhood, she just picked a fight with the one woman who knows exactly where every skeleton can be found and how to use them. By the end of that week, it felt like the whole neighborhood had split into invisible camps. You could tell which side someone was on by the way they looked at Andrea when she drove home in her cruiser. Either a quiet nod of solidarity or a stiff wave with narrowed eyes. Karen, meanwhile, was losing her grip. Word had spread that Andrea was gathering evidence. A few homeowners who'd been afraid for years finally found their voices. They'd show up at our porch in the evenings, clutching dusty boxes of old statements, grainy photos of repairs that never happened, checks for fines they never agreed to pay. Andrea logged everything like the seasoned investigator she was, building her case detail by detail. But the more Andrea dug, the more Karen flailed. I spotted her across the street one night, pacing her porch like she was waiting for an invasion. She'd glare over, phone glued to her ear, probably spinning new stories to anyone who'd listen. Rumors swirled that she was planning a special emergency HOA meeting to vote Andrea out as a resident entirely. Apparently, she thought she could override state law with her printed bylaws and a clipboard. One night, the tension cracked wide open. Andrea had just come in from her shift, shoulders sagging from the weight of the day. She dropped her keys on the counter and turned to me, voice low. "I just got word Karen's been trying to file an official complaint with the city claiming I'm misusing my position. She wants an ethics investigation." I felt my stomach drop. "Can she do that?" "She can try," Andrea said, her jaw set. "But once I'm forced to answer her accusations, I get to open up everything about her HOA dealings." She's practically inviting the spotlight. The next day, it felt like we were living in a glass house. Neighbors we'd never even met stopped by with supportive words or fresh stories about Karen's intimidation tactics. One couple admitted they'd been too scared to put up a swing set for their kids because Karen threatened to fine them for unsightly structures. Another neighbor whispered about missing funds from a so-called community improvement fund that no one ever saw materialize. At the same time, Andrea's own department started to sniff around. Not because they didn't trust her, but because if a chief of police was being targeted by the head of an HOA, it could ripple into something bigger. One officer, Jenkins, the same young cop who'd shown up on that first call, knocked on our door one night. He looked nervous. "Chief, I probably shouldn't say this, but Karen's been calling the station every day. She's spinning stories about you intimidating her with your badge. Some folks are starting to ask questions." Andrea thanked him for the heads up, her expression unreadable. After he left, she stood at the window watching Karen's porch light flick on and off again. It's like she wants to burn the entire neighborhood down just to feel powerful one more time. The final push came when Andrea got a tip that shook her. A neighbor slipped her an envelope with grainy photocopies of receipts contractors paid under the table, landscaping work that was double-billed, fines issued for imaginary violations. It was all signed off by Karen's hand. Andrea turned to me that night, eyes fierce, exhaustion forgotten. "She's not going to stop. But this is it. I'm taking this to the board, the Real HOA board, not just her loyal lapdogs. If they won't listen, we go straight to the city. I'm not just clearing my name. I'm tearing this whole mess apart so nobody else gets hurt." We knew Karen would try something drastic to stop her. And sure enough, the morning Andrea planned to present the evidence, our doorbell rang before dawn. I opened it to find an official-looking envelope taped to the handle. A cease and desist letter accusing Andrea of harassment and threatening legal action if she continued to slander Karen's good name. Andrea read it, chuckled, then set it down on the kitchen table like a trophy. "You know what this means, right?" she said, glancing at me with that calm, unshakable look I'd fallen in love with years ago. "She's terrified. And now she's cornered." I didn't say a word. I just stood beside her, heart pounding as she stacked the files neatly in her bag. We both knew this showdown was going to flip our peaceful, picket fence neighborhood upside down. And Karen? She had no idea just how bad it was about to get for her. It was almost poetic how the whole neighborhood seemed to hold its breath that morning. Andrea left the house before sunrise, her case file tucked under one arm like a shield. I watched her pull out of the driveway in her patrol car, not because she was on duty, but because she wanted the entire street to see she wasn't hiding who she was anymore. Meanwhile, Karen must have sensed the storm rolling in. She was on her porch at 6 a.m., pacing in her robe, cell phone glued to her ear. She didn't even glance my way when I stepped out to grab the paper. If I didn't know better, I'd almost feel sorry for her. Almost. Andrea met the Real HOA board in a private conference room at City Hall, no Karen loyalists to shout her down this time. She laid out every receipt, every forged signature, every phantom fine that never touched a community project. I later heard she even pulled up a spreadsheet showing just how much money had vanished under Karen's reign. But the twist? The board didn't look shocked, not really. Turns out Karen had been so smug, so sure of her little kingdom that she'd gotten sloppy. Some of the board members had suspected her for years but were too afraid to dig deeper. Andrea gave them what they needed, proof they could act on. The real bombshell, though, didn't come from Andrea's files, it came from Jenkins, the young officer who'd been at our house that day Karen called 911. He'd quietly gathered his own statements from neighbors, screenshots of messages Karen sent to intimidate him into backing her up. Jenkins stepped forward during that meeting and testified that Karen had tried to bribe him to write up a fake incident report, painting Andrea as mentally unstable and armed. When Andrea told me this later, I nearly dropped my coffee. She really tried to bribe an officer? I asked. Andrea just smiled, that calm, coiled confidence shining through. She thought she could bend the badge the same way she bends HOA rules. By the time she drove home, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Some folks pretended they hadn't signed Karen's petition, suddenly acting like they'd always been on Andrea's side. Others doubled down, standing in clusters on driveways, whispering about the chief and what she'll do now. And then Karen did the unthinkable. She showed up at our door. No fake notices, no folded petitions. Just her, standing there in broad daylight, eyes wild, hair pinned back so tight it looked painful. She didn't even bother with a forced smile this time. "I know what you're doing," she hissed. "You think you can ruin me with your files and your little cop friends? This is my neighborhood. I built it. You think they'll thank you when their property values tank? When your lies hit the news?" Andrea stood there, silent, letting Karen spit her venom. Then she calmly stepped outside, closing the door behind her so our kids wouldn't hear. I watched through the front window as the two women squared off on our porch. "Karen, you lied to the people you claimed to protect," Andrea said, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "You stole from them. And you tried to weaponize the law against me. You really thought you could get away with that." Karen lunged forward, jabbing a finger into Andrea's chest, and that was the moment neighbors started peeking from behind curtains again. A few even stepped onto their lawns, phones held low but recording every second. "Watch your back, Chief," Karen snarled, voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Andrea didn't flinch. She just tilted her head slightly, almost pitying her. "Karen, you're about to find out what happens when you poke a hornet's nest full of people you thought were too scared to sting." That night, Andrea got a text from the HOA board chair. They were calling an emergency community meeting. Everyone would be there. Every homeowner, every whispering neighbor, and Karen herself. And for the first time, it wouldn't be Karen running the show. It felt like the whole street exhaled when the emergency HOA meeting was announced. For the first time in years, people who'd never dared to speak up found themselves standing together in the same clubhouse room, shoulder to shoulder, glancing over at Karen with a mix of dread and quiet anticipation. Andrea and I sat near the front, the thick folder of evidence perched on her lap like a final verdict waiting to be read. Karen strutted in 10 minutes late, flanked by her few remaining loyalists, that fake grin nailed to her face. But even from the back, you could see the panic flickering behind her eyes. The board chair called the meeting to order, voice trembling at first, but steadying as he laid out why they were all there. Misappropriated funds, intimidation, falsified fines, and the attempted character assassination of the town's chief of police, all orchestrated by one person. Each word felt like a nail driven into the coffin Karen had built for herself. When it was Andrea's turn, she stood calmly, scanning the room as if daring anyone to look away. She spoke like she did when she addressed her officers. Direct, unwavering, and human. She explained how Karen had targeted not just her, but anyone who threatened her petty grip on power. She held up photocopies of bank transfers that never reached community projects, letters threatening to lean families into submission. Then Andrea looked straight at Karen. "You called the police on me because you thought you could humiliate me. But you didn't just come after me, you came after every single person here. You used fear to keep people quiet. That ends tonight." The room erupted, some people clapped, others shouted questions at Karen she couldn't answer. She tried to shout back, her voice cracking, eyes darting around for support that wasn't there anymore. Her last words were desperate. "You're all turning on me. She's manipulating you. She's the one with the gun." That's when Jenkins stepped forward. The young officer cleared his throat and, in front of the entire community, calmly described how Karen had tried to bribe him. He laid out his own statement, the messages, the threats. The hush that fell over the room was the final nail. Karen's shoulders sagged. She didn't storm out, she slunk out, alone, past neighbors who wouldn't even meet her eyes. Andrea sat back down, exhaling a breath she'd been holding for weeks. She squeezed my hand under the table, her voice soft. "I didn't do this to be a hero. she whispered. I just wanted people to remember they have a right to stand up. And as we walked home under the glow of the porch lights, I knew one thing for sure. This neighborhood would never be the same, and Karen would never be the only one with power again. By the next morning, the clubhouse scene had become the talk of the town. It wasn't just the HOA gossip mill anymore. The local news had picked up whispers of the story. Headlines danced around words like embezzlement, misconduct, and abuse of power. It was like the sunshine finally poured into corners of this neighborhood that had stayed dark for too long. I stood on our porch sipping my coffee while Andrea sat on the steps beside me. Hair pulled back, phone blowing up with messages from people she'd never even met. One by one, they thanked her for standing up, for showing them that one bully didn't have to define how we all lived. For the first time since we moved in, the neighborhood felt honest. Not perfect, not completely fixed, but honest. People waved when they passed us now. Not that stiff, forced wave they gave when they were scared of Karen seeing. It was genuine. A few neighbors stopped by to offer homemade pies or ask Andrea how they could help get the HOA back on track. The Harrisons, the family Karen fined over and over for their unauthorized fence, came by with their 3 kids. The father, Dan, shook Andrea's hand so hard I thought it might break. You didn't just stand up for you. You stood up for all of us, he said, voice cracking a bit. His wife slipped Andrea a small box of cookies they'd baked together. Simple gestures. But to Andrea, they meant more than any official medal ever could. Later that night, when the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, Andrea and I sat at the kitchen table again. The same table where she'd first stacked all those files, piecing together the puzzle that would bring Karen down. She ran her fingers along the grain of the wood and said, "Funny how this started because I wore my badge home. You think it's really over?" I asked. Part of me still half expected to see Karen's porch light flicker back on with some new scheme brewing. Andrea looked out the window, then back at me. It'll never be perfect. But now people know they don't have to bow down just because someone calls themselves in charge. That's enough for me. In the weeks that followed, the HOA board held a vote. Karen was removed, officially, legally, unanimously. She didn't even show up to fight it. Rumor is she moved out of state to live with a cousin, muttering about how this town turned on her. The neighborhood didn't turn on her. They just finally turned toward each other. Andrea's life didn't go back to the way it was before, it got busier. Neighbors asked her to help draft new bylaws that protected families instead of punishing them. She held Q&A nights at the community clubhouse explaining people's rights in plain English. Sometimes I'd watch her stand there in front of a circle of folding chairs, badge clipped to her belt, sleeves rolled up, a simple smile on her face. Not the chief they feared, the chief they trusted. One evening, as we walked home from one of those meetings, Andrea slipped her hand in mine and said, "You know, when Karen called the cops that day, she thought she'd humiliate me." She paused, squeezed my hand a little tighter. But maybe we needed her to push us this far. People don't change until they're forced to see what they've been putting up with. And she was right. Sometimes it takes the loudest bully in the cul-de-sac to remind you that silence is just another way to say yes to being controlled. So if you're watching this and you've got your own Karen in your neighborhood, your workplace, anywhere, maybe now's the time to ask, what am I willing to stand up for? Who am I willing to stand up for? Don't let someone else decide what your home, your peace, or your family should look like. Not every fight needs a badge, sometimes it just needs a voice that refuses to back down. And if this story gave you even a shred of courage, do me one favor, hit that like button, share this video, and tell your own story in the comments below. Maybe someone out there is waiting to see they're not alone. Because they aren't, not as long as people like you and Andrea are willing to stand your ground.